Hello everybody, Blue Dooley, and we're working on the Grand Hauler in this video. We're going to kind of get the lift axle mounted up. I'm not happy with the way the axle itself came up. I'll show you what I got, and then I'm going to show you how I'm going to mount the links and the brackets to the chassis. And then I'm actually going to order some steer axles and then get them bolted to the chassis for the lift axle, and then I'll have an extra one for the trailer. We're also going to get into soldering the lights up to the SFR-1 in this video, and we'll also kind of show how we're going to do the lights on the snowplow in this video as well. So first off, we're starting with some fab work. We'll get you in here and show you kind of what's going on, and then we'll get some welding done. So I bent up an axle out of the square stock, and then found some 5mm bolts that I welded on to it. So that's kind of where we're at right now. However, my bolts, no matter how careful I was, I couldn't get them straight with the axle. Just not pleased with the way this turned out. So I'm going to order a steering axle, and I'm going to use that instead of this kind of bent piece of crap I came up with. It'd work, but I'm just not really happy with it. It's also a little too narrow. I did some math wrong somewhere, and these needed to be spaced out just a little bit more. But it will do for mock-up purposes. We'll get you back under here for now. And the two existing holes in the frame for the cross member are pretty much right where in line with where the axle needs to be. And of course the heater needs to come on because I'm talking. So I need to take the battery box off the truck, and I'm going to have to pull the tanks off each side. Metal over here. What I have is some aluminum channel that has a 1/4 inch opening, and it is 3 feet. So I had wanted, what I had initially planned on doing was just mounting it outside up close to the tanks like so. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out how low I want the links to be, and then I'll notch part of it out, and it'll actually be underneath the frame rails instead of sitting outside it. That way I can tuck them up behind the tank a little bit and have a little bit longer link so the tires don't move in such a dramatic arc when they raise and lower. So let's go ahead and get some more stuff pulled off the truck. And like I said, we're going to use this axle kind of for figuring out where the bracket needs to be and how long these pieces of square stock need to be to reach the axle. And then we'll just use a stock Tamiya semi-truck axle for my lift axle. Okay, there's a couple of ways you can cut metal. Use a cutoff wheel on a Dremel, or a cutoff wheel on a grinder, or a small hacksaw, or if you have an air compressor, untangle hose. If you have an air compressor, you can use an air saw, which is exactly what I'm going to use, because I actually think with the small hacksaw or this air saw, you get a little cleaner cut. You also don't have to worry about sparks. I mean, yeah, it makes a lot of noise. But you get a nice, I didn't get quite straight, but you get a little cleaner cut than you would with the grinder cutoff wheel or a Dremel and a cutoff wheel. The other nice thing about it is I can hold the part immediately after cutting. If you use a grinder and a cutoff wheel, aluminum soaks up heat really fast, so the part's easier to handle after a cut than using anything else. And again, you get a nicer cut, I think. Really kind of depends the tools on your disposal. I might do a video someday of all the tools I got. But here's our piece. I'm gonna unstick you from the sledgehammer there. Stick you to the workbench. So I'll sand this on the belt sander, clean it up a little more. But on second look, I think I am going to mount it just behind the fuel tanks on the outside of the rail, as that gives me at least a couple inches for my link. And then I can adjust the axle position a little more after I get the mounts in, and then these will get painted, of course. So I'm not sure, I haven't decided how I'm going to bolt it to the frame, of course. But I'm not sure if maybe I'm going to notch this out so I can just get straight to it, or if I'm going to drill a bigger hole on the outside of the piece so I can get the screw all the way through. That probably, I would actually say, is more of your personal preference than necessarily going 100% scale, as 100% scale would actually be a drop forged piece, like an actual hanger on the front end, on a leaf spring hanger or a link hanger, and it would bolt on each side and just hang down below the frame a little bit and be a little different than this kind of aftermarket application, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to sand this piece up and then cut another piece, and then we'll figure out how I'm going to modify it so it actually bolts to the chassis. Got my 2 brackets, and I ran them on the sander, cleaned up the edges a little bit, just smoothed them out so they're a little rounded. And I think what'll look the best, I'm going to take the Dremel and kind of slice right along here, and then I'm going to bend the outside over. And I have some I think I have some aluminum brazing rods, so I can braze it together. If not, I might just get some JB Weld, kind of smear it in there, smooth it out, so when it's painted it'll look like it's welded, but it's not. And then I have the bumper bracket, which I've already mangled a bunch. But I think I'll drill the holes in the frame where I want the bracket to go, and then I'll use the bumper bracket so I can use the coarser thread screws and thread them into this bracket to hold my bracket to the outside of the frame. And then this will give me some other places to mount some other stuff too if I need to. Like I can put some holes in the top and put a bigger deck plate on here if I want, or mount some other things to it. As I do need to get a drive shaft, you can see I have a short drive shaft coming out here. I'm just going to run a piece of 5mm rod up close, tucked up to the chassis with a bearing on each end. And then I'll have the drive shafts on each end. That'll clean everything up underneath the truck, and there's going to be so much stuff sitting on top of it, you're not really going to see that 5mm rod anyways. So that should be here, I think, Friday. But the truck's not actually ready to be driven yet at all anyways, as I do need to order that steer axle. So let me get some holes drilled in the frame here and get stuff lined up. Like I said, I need to cut these how I'm thinking, and then we'll get them bolted to the chassis. So I cut along this side, and the cutoff wheel came apart on me, so I had to get in here with the hacksaw. So I didn't get quite as far as I'd have liked. Then just took the chisel and hammer. I actually stuck a piece of the square stock here, like that, and stuck it in the vise, clamped it down really good, and then just hammered this in over a little bit. I'd like it to curve in just a little more, and then I'll kind of trim this up. Get you. The only problem with a magnet based on a metal workbench is it's hard to move you sometimes. Oop. So I get my thumb out of the way and get some light. The screw head's going to land right kind of in the middle of that bend, unfortunately. So I think what I might do is just cut that piece out instead of trying to fold it over. And there's not going to be a ton of weight on this bracket, so I suppose I don't need to engineer this like you would on a full-size rig, because it's just not going to see the forces on this RC truck that a full-size rig will see. So I just need it to work and, be presentable. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to nick that out, trim this up, and then I'll cut the other piece to match. So I'll need to drill 2 holes in the frame, and I got another cross member over there I can use in this cross member, so they're just about almost to the top of the bend. They're just like maybe a millimeter below the top of the rail, and then the bottom of the rail up from the bottom of the rail. So let me tinker with the bracket a little bit more, and then we'll get these bolted to the chassis. Got both of my brackets made. They aren't 100% even on the curve here, so I'll have to clean them up a little bit. But these are going to be the chassis brackets, and I just realized if you don't have a lot of fabrication tools or space, the square stock I'm using is 1/4 by 1/4. And these are the RC 4-wheel drive Armageddon dump truck leaf spring mounts, because that's what's on the front of the snowplower is the Armageddon springs. So what you could actually do, if you only have a drill really, is you could use these, and you could still use the flat stock like I'm using. There'd be a little wiggle room in there, but that's all right. So all you'd have to do is drill out your hole, and then you could actually use the pins that come with the leaf springs. And then I know it's black on black, but that would, if you use the longer mount, which would be the front spring hanger, you could just drill your 2 holes and use the RC 4-wheel drive spring hangers, or you could use the stock Tamiya leaf spring hangers, as the Armageddon truck's meant to bolt underneath the frame, so this side's curved out. So if you want them to be on the outside of the frame rails, you'd have to use just a stock leaf spring hanger, but these ones are pretty sturdy, and if you don't mind them being underneath the chassis, actually looks like it'd bolt in place of that hole right there. So then you'd really only have to drill one hole if you can use an existing hole in the frame already. That'd save you a little fabrication work if you don't want to go to the extreme I am, or if you're hurting for a little more space, these would tuck up behind the fuel tanks really easily. In fact, actually, we'll scoot them up here, and you're probably not going to be able to see them, but they will. They'd even hide behind the steps. So that could also be an option for you, is a standard old leaf spring hanger in place of a bracket. Then again, all you have to do is drill your holes, one hole in this end, and then I'm going to use U-bolts on the other end that bolts to the front axle. You could probably put a little bend in it if you wanted to keep your caster from going too crazy. Where's that camber? I think caster's the relationship of the top and the bottom. Camber's in and out. It's been a while since I messed with that stuff, so. But I'm gonna finish cleaning these up a little bit, and then we'll get drilling some holes. So there's one suspension bracket done. I'm gonna do pretty much the exact same thing on the other side. Then I'll actually still have these pins. I'll get one out here. Just sent a little piece flying somewhere. But I got these little brass bushing, or pins. That'll be long enough to go through the bracket. Plenty long enough to go through the bracket. You can't see it because my giant thumb's in the way. So this pin will drill out a hole through this bracket, and I'll cut some square stock. I'll drill a hole through it, and then I can just use a little E-clip on the other side. Have a nice bushing or pin, brass pin for that end of the suspension. Then it'll be off to paint. So let's get the other side. I'll do the other side off camera. Let me cut off a piece of flat stock, get this drilled out for that pin, and get the flat or square stock drilled out for the pin. And then that way you can kind of see the whole thing together in one piece. Then I can paint it all, and then when I do final assembly, I can put these on and then get the tanks back in place. Got the driver's side finished up. My cutting bit got a little away from me here, so I put a washer on both of those. Covers up the little bit bigger hole. There's just a paper width between the bracket and the fuel tank, and that is quite all right. I'll get you up in here. That's what it looks like from the top. I cut that square stock longer than I know I'd need it. As when I get the steering axle, since I'm going to use square U-bolts over that, having that a little long is going to allow me to shift the axle forward and backward to get the alignment right. And then I can either trim it later or just leave it long, and that'll be where the lift servo is at. So this particular setup, if you would put a set of tandems on it, you'd just trim this down and weld this bar directly to the axle. And then alignment on a real truck is there's a cam bolt at this end, and that's how you position the axle to get your alignment correct. You do need the loop, like I showed earlier, to clear the drive shaft. So you can 3D print an axle or bend up a axle, and then yeah, this is straight how they are on a real truck. Like I said, this particular setup would be more for a set of tandems. For steering axle, I'm just going to use a factory steering axle and then use the U-bolts to bolt this and then that's how I'll get my alignment correct. On even a trailer suspension, it's just a single beam out to the axle, and the axle's either bolted to this beam or tubing, or it's welded. It's welded, like I said, even the non-welded ones have a cam bolt over here. So it's a very simple setup. There's not supposed to be a lot of flex in these suspensions. So you just have a single airbag here, if it were a trailer suspension. And then for a lift axle, you'd have a bag here, and then you'd have a small bag underneath that would press against kind of an L bracket, and that would raise the axle up off the ground. That would dump that bag and fill this bag to push it into the ground. And that's really quite simply how pretty much every lift axle you've ever seen on a truck works. The only real difference is the steering axle on the front discharge cement trucks or mixer trucks. It's a steering axle, and then this beam comes up to a pivot, and instead of having, well, depends on the truck too, but it'll actually have a hydraulic ram that comes down here, and it might have an airbag out here, or it might not, and just uses a hydraulic cylinder as its shock. But they're pretty straightforward. There's nothing too complex about it. So if you've been wanting to add a drop axle to your truck, it is really that simple. The most complicated thing you're going to have to figure out is where to hide the servo to actuate the axle up and down. That'll be the most difficult part. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually mount the servo widthwise in here. So the arm will clear the drive shaft, and then I'll bolt a small shock to the steering axle to just hold it in place. And then either I'll figure out how to make kind of a fake airbag, or I might not. I might just cover it up with a fender, because from a distance, unless you're this close, you're not going to actually notice those little details. So those kind of details are how far you want to go with the build. Like, you could change out all the hardware for scale hardware if you want to go that serious with it. I'm not that serious about getting it scale accurate, so I'll just leave the Phillips in, and then just have some random bolts. I'll at least match all the bolts together. They match. But I'm not changing hardware for this build. So what I need to do now is just cut another piece of the square tubing, and then get the holes drilled in that other bracket so I can bolt it in place. And then it'll be a quick shot of paint, and I can assemble this, and then just put the suspension together, or the axle together, and then the suspension once I get the steering axle in. So I'm going to finish up that other side, and then when we come back, we'll be in the office and we'll do some soldering. There's an L and it's not silent, it's soldering. What I'm working on now is getting the cab lights wired in to the ribbon strand that connects to the SFR. These are very, very thin wires, so you don't need a super hot soldering iron to solder these together. You do, however, depending on where you get your LEDs. If the LEDs already don't have a resistor, you need a 320 ohm resistor to cut down the power so you don't pop your LEDs. The red wire runs up to the flasher bar. It doesn't need a resistor because it's meant to run off a 9-volt battery, or you're just straight from your radio with a BEC. And then the clearance lights on the top of the cab, I already put a resistor in to make them dimmer with the other light controller. And the resistors I got are so big, I think I'm just going to use one. And then all the lights will tie into this resistor, and I got plenty of room to kind of solder everything. And then I'll just put some heat shrink tubing over it. So that resistor will power all the other lights except the light bar and the clearance lights, as I mentioned. I have some really tiny heat shrink tubing. I mean, really tiny stuff. And the directions to me were a little confusing. I had to play with it a little bit. It switches, the SFR switches the negative, but the black and white wires are said to be ground, but they actually supply the power, and the colors are ground. So that confused me a little bit. I think I popped a LED. Well, that's why they didn't work when I first tested them, because I had them wired in the way I thought they were supposed to go, and I need to wire them all in backwards. So now that I got the light bar and the clearance lights wired in, I'm going to get everything wired up to that resistor and then go through the training software and figure out which color I need for which set of light, or which light I need. I already know that prop 8 I had assigned to the light bar and got it working. The other thing I need to do is I can't with this soldering iron get it hot enough to do the battery cables. So I'll have to get the big old gun out, and I'm going to wire the SFR to the hobby wing and then run some longer leads out to make plugging it in and out of the truck easier. There's a ton of videos on soldering wires, and there are people who are way better at wiring than me. So I'm just going to kind of cover the basics. If you want to learn how to solder, again, there are plenty of channels who can do a lot better job teaching than I can. So what I'm going to do is, just like I said, finish patching all my positives into this resistor now that I have the other stuff wired up that doesn't go to the resistor. And then it'll just be matching the wires to the colors so I can get all the lights wired in. The chassis lights are going to be the only lights that have a plug between here and the chassis. The body lights will all be hardwired in, and the chassis lights will have a splice plug in them. That way, if I take the body off, I can just unplug those lights, unplug this ribbon cable, and then I can take the body off with no problem. So I'll get some more wires wired up, and then we'll kind of end the video, hopefully by testing them. As you can see, a bit of a mess. Now, the brake lights I have configured as American combined, and I have the brake lights set so anytime the truck isn't moving or there's no throttle input, the brake lights turn off. So when I put the throttle stick in neutral, you will see they light up. If I bump them forward a little bit, they'll turn off. And then the turn signals are hooked up. And I have the light bar working. On the front, let's turn on the right one. My right turn indicator is working. The left turn, when I was testing before I got the resistors, I blew that one out. So I need to get that light working. I'll have to replace that LED. So there's the light bar as stationary. It's doing its work-like thing, telling you to go to the left-hand side of the truck. If we bump it, it'll go back to that kind of slow scan. There's 12 modes, and that one I'm really kind of a fan of because it's not an intense strobe, some of the other ones. So now it thinks it's parked. Then it'll turn on its work lights. Not an ideal setup, I'd say, for the Tamiya Grand Haulers or the semi-trucks, but the My Trick RC stuff is really nice, and I like the way it's looking on the truck right now. I don't have the speaker hooked up. So I'll come around here. You're not going to get a good shot of it. But that ribbon cable is tied into everything except a backup light. I forgot to wire that in. But everything else is hooked up. That's going to do it for this video. I'm going to keep on working on and figure out how to program the lights to a switch. So my rear cab lights are going to be the same as the lights on the chassis, so they're going to do all the same functions. I just think it looks good. But yeah, that's where we're at. Go ahead and click like so I can continue making content people enjoy, and be sure to subscribe so you can see this thing not a mess. And we'll catch you in the next video.